been sitting here for over a month. I think it's time to show you what's inside. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. Earlier this year, I purchased myself a little present in the world's fastest small form factor graphics card with the RTX A2000. But of course, time marches on, and just 6 months later, not only has the A2000 been surpassed, its replacement flat out destroys it. Meet the RTX 4000 Ada Generation SFF card, the newest and without a doubt fastest small form factor GPU in the world. It doesn't look much different, but holy crap, is this one so much faster. To understand what makes the RTX SFF 4000 so special, we actually need to go back a couple generations to this little guy in the Tesla P4. This is a small form factor graphics card, and I've featured it on the channel before, but as a quick refresher, this is a card designed for data center compute, or what we might refer to today as an AI accelerator. While it is a graphics card, it lacks any kind of display output, because it was supposed to just sit inside of a server rack and crunch numbers its entire life. What makes it so special is the fact that unlike consumer or even entry-level workstation GPUs made by NVIDIA, the silicon on board this one isn't some cut-down package. You normally see form factors like this, that is, the half-height, half-length cards like the NVIDIA P400 from the same generation, have equally tiny graphics processors on board, with the P400 featuring just 256 CUDA cores and 2 GB of GDDR5. The P4 is instead packing the same exact GP104 GPU as the GTX 1080. That's 2,560 CUDA cores and a full 8 GB of GDDR5 crammed onto this tiny little package. Of course, the P4 is also limited to 70 watts of power draw, but for data center AI tasks, that's a ton of parallel processing that it can chew through with relative ease. But again, the P4 doesn't have the ability to output to a monitor, which means any gaming or workstation-like tasks can be rather difficult without a full virtualization setup. NVIDIA also made a Turing variant of this card called the T4, but it was in the same form factor and also lacked video outputs. When Ampere GPUs were announced, it seemed NVIDIA would keep on the same trend with this same form factor, as they introduced AI accelerator cards like the A2 and the A16, both of which I've actually also reviewed on this channel. I'll have video links in the description if you want to go check those out. While the A2 kept the same form factor, it also used some of NVIDIA's lower tier silicon in the GA107, with just 1,280 CUDA cores. Even with Ampere bringing some seriously improved architecture, this was still a massive letdown given the density of the previous generation cards. But then, in a bit of a surprise move, NVIDIA launched the RTX A2000, a 70-watt small form factor card with a GA106. While it's not as impressive as NVIDIA's 104 level GPUs, it still features 3,328 CUDA cores and either 6 or 12 GB of GDDR6 memory. Also new to this form factor is, check this out, active cooling, meaning you can run this card in either a server or a desktop workstation without the need for the high airflow that normally comes with a server chassis. The A2000 also added back video outputs to the equation, making the A2000 the de facto winner in this space if you needed the highest performance and smallest form factor desktop GPU possible. While it's definitely meant for professional use, and it's not exactly cheap at $499, the A2000 is a highly capable card for playing games at 1080p. In fact, it's made an appearance on this channel as the GPU that powered my Xbox One S case mod, offering up some fantastic performance all while sipping on power and staying incredibly cool, both incredibly important factors in small cases like that. But what if NVIDIA actually combined the best of the A2000, active cooling, video outputs, with the insane silicon density and the form factor of the Tesla P4, a GeForce 80 class GPU die, and a ton of memory to match? Well, the result would look like this. This is the NVIDIA RTX 4000 Ada Generation SFF, and yes, that is its full official name. But it's exactly the card that's possible if you start listing all of your dream specs on the back of a napkin. At its heart is an AD104 GPU die with 6,144 CUDA cores. It's the same GPU die found on the RTX 4070, but at a slightly higher bin, as the 4070 only has 5,888 CUDA cores enabled, with the RTX 4070 Ti rocking 7,680. The 4000 SFF is also not lacking for memory, with a full 20 gigabytes of GDDR6 packed onto this tiny little card. A definite return to form for Nvidia, as both the Tesla T4 and the RTX A2 pack 16 gigabytes into the same form factor. Like the A2000, the 4000 SFF has a TDP of just 70 watts and runs completely off motherboard bus power, not needing additional plugs from your power supply. It does this by significantly lowering the clock speed on the GPU compared to the desktop counterparts. We're looking at a GPU boost clock of just 1560 MHz, while the RTX 4070 can jump well north of 2500 MHz, but that also requires more than 200 watts of power to make that happen. As I've shown before with the Tesla T4, most GPU workloads benefit from highly parallel processing rather than raw clock speed, meaning you get vastly more performance per watt out of, say, 6,144 CUDA cores versus 1,280 CUDA cores at the same TDP. So gaming performance is amazingly good for those willing to pay for it. And I'm sure you all knew this moment was coming, but now for the bad news. If you're looking for a small form factor card, this is absolutely the fastest thing that is out there. But it also comes at a price. NVIDIA's AD104 GPU starts in the RTX 4070 at $600, and that's for only 12 gigabytes of memory included, and a much less dense PCB design. Silicon and memory, when they're packed this densely, isn't exactly cheap, especially when they're also validated for professional work, as all RTX series cards are. With that in mind, the RTX 4000 Ada SFF comes in at $1,249, or around 2.5 times the price of its predecessor in the RTX A2000. There's no easy way to say this. That's a lot of money. But when your only competition is low-end silicon that can barely draw 50 watts, it's a pretty easy price to justify. But even with that high-end price tag, we are looking at nearly double the CUDA cores and 3 times the memory of that 6GB A2000. So maybe the price tag is backed up by performance. Well, there's only one way to find out. My test bench for today is sticking with the low power theme of these two GPUs, and I'll be running my Irying 11th Gen Tiger Lake motherboard with an i7 11800H 8-core CPU paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 running at 3600 MTS. It's a fantastic combo that draws only around 70 watts at max tilt, meaning this entire PC is only going to draw about 140 watts at max power. This is going to be a heads-up battle between the RTX A2000 and the RTX 4000 Ada SFF, but I did add in an RTX 3070 in the synthetic test just to give some context to where performance sits compared to more traditional gaming GPUs. Starting off with our synthetics and 3D Mark Firestrike, the RTX A2000 comes out swinging as best it can, with an overall score of 15,436, a graphics score of 16,536, and a combined score of 7,632. Those feel like pretty good scores for a 1080p gaming card. That is until you compare it to the RTX 4000 SFF, with a score of 24,212 in the overall test, or about 57% faster. Graphics scores were a full 80% faster at 29,692. But really, it's only until you contextualize those scores with the RTX 3070 that you realize how impressive the 4000 SFF is, as we're within only 10% of the overall score and 15% of the graphics score of an RTX 3070 on the same exact platform. In fact, if you look at the combined score, we're only 2% off of that full-fat desktop graphics card. That same trend continues in DirectX 12 with 3D Mark Time Spy, where the RTX 4000 SFF managed an overall score of 10,923, a full 66% faster than the RTX A2000 and its 6578. But again, it's the graphics isolated test that shows the biggest difference between the two cards, where the 4000 SFF is 77% faster than the A2000, scoring a 10,836 to just 6115. The comparison to the RTX 3070 also comes up a little less rosy in DirectX 12, where the 4000 SFF was about 20% slower than the RTX 3070. However, given the 3070 uses almost 3 times the power, this is still a very impressive result. And finally, I wanted to take a look at ray tracing differences between these three cards, so I fired up the 3D Mark Port Royal test, where the results were very interesting. The RTX A2000 managed a score of 3479, or a frame per second average of about 16.1. The 4000 SFF clocked in about 85% faster, with a score of 6438, or a 29.8 frame per second average. And again, to the surprise of no one, the RTX 3070 came out on top, but only by about 22%, with a score of 8,279, or a 38 frame per second average. And finally, let's jump into some gaming. All games were tested at 1080p resolution and the highest graphics settings that I could manage with the RTX A2000's 6GB of memory. I only ran into an issue once, and that was in Doom Eternal. So let's go ahead and start there. At ultra settings, the A2000 managed an average of 143 FPS, a 1% low of 108, and a 0.1% low of 94. Again, some pretty decent results for a 1080p gaming card, but it is absolutely destroyed by the 4000 SFF, with an average of 258 frames per second, a 1% low of 187, and a 0.1% low of 157. In a trend you'll see repeated throughout these benchmarks, the 0.1% low in Doom Eternal on the 4000 SFF was faster than the average frame rate of the A2000. I think that's pretty much going to sum up the tests, but let's run through the rest of them just for fun. Project Cars 3 at ultra settings saw an even bigger discrepancy between the two cards, with the A2000 clocking an 88.5 frame per second average, a 1% low of 75, and a 0.1% low of 65. Meanwhile, the 4000 Ada clocked in a 171 frame per second average, a 1% low of 121, and a 0.1% low of 96. That's a 92% improvement on the average frame rate, and a 48% improvement in the 0.1% lows. In Red Dead Redemption 2, at 1080p and high settings, the A2000 managed a 61 frame per second average, a 1% low of 45, and a 0.1% low of 42. Again, pretty respectable for 1080p results. But the RTX 4000 Ada managed a 102 FPS average, or about a 68% improvement. But that's not the biggest story. That's actually in the 1% and the 0.1% lows, where the 4000 SFF is a full 76 and 75% faster than the A2000 in both of those metrics, with a score of 79 and 74 FPS. I wanted to leave most of these benchmarks at rasterized testing only and avoid any ray tracing, but I figured I'd toss at least one game in there in Spider-Man Remastered. Here the A2000 does manage an average of 78 frames per second, a 1% low of 45, and a 0.1% low of 31. The RTX A2000 tops it by around 35%, with a score of 105 frames per second on average, a 1% low of 58, and a 0.1% low of 46. Jumping into Starfield at 1080p and medium settings, the RTX A2000 has a pretty modest showing at 45 FPS on average, a 1% low of 29, and a 0.1% low of 21, again making this game fairly playable at this resolution. The 4000 SFF manages one of its best improvements for the day, specifically in the 0.1% low. We get an average of 75 FPS, a 1% low of 43, and a 0.1% low of 37, for around a 75% improvement over the A2000. If Baldur's Gate 3 was any other genre of game, that is, not an isometric role-playing turn-based game, it would be lambasted for its poor performance. Here we see the RTX A2000 get an average of 48 frames per second, a 1% low of 22, and a 0.1% low of 7.1. On the 4000 SFF, we did manage nearly 80 frames per second on average and a 1% low of 36. We did improve the 0.1% lows as well by almost 30%, but it's still in single digits at 9.2 FPS versus 7.1 on the A2000. And speaking of games that stutter pretty much all the time and very repeatedly, we come to Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. We're at high settings at 1080p, and this one actually surprised me with how smooth the gameplay was. The RTX A2000 managed an average of 66 frames per second, a 1% low of 44, and a 0.1% low of 34. Typically, lower-end graphics cards struggle mightily with this game, specifically when switching from hip view to scope fire repeatedly, where the 0.1% low can easily hit single digits. So, 34 FPS, not too shabby, and that's even on the A2000. Switching over to the RTX 4000 SFF, we see an average of 115 FPS, a 1% low of 81, and a 0.1% low of 49, or about a 46% improvement in those 0.1% lows. So, some pretty impressive results in and of themselves, but if the RTX 3070 wasn't enough to cement just how insanely performant this little GPU is, here's a couple other cards from my collection that this card managed to straight up destroy. This is the Radeon 7 and the RTX 2080 Ti. This card is faster than both of those. But again, getting down to what we came here to check out, and that is the performance differential between the RTX A2000 and the new RTX 4000 Ada generation SFF. On average in gaming, we see an improvement of about 68% in average frame rates on the 4000 SFF. But again, it was the 0.1% lows that saw a very significant improvement as well, jumping up about 58% on average between the two cards. Ray tracing performance was also about 85% faster on the 4000 SFF as well, although that has more to do with this having 48 RT cores versus just 26 on the A2000. But this is also RTX 3.0 approved, meaning that you can have all of the DLS 3.0 and all of the other goodies that come with that versus the Ampere generation of cards. So, where does that leave us between these two cards? Yes, the 4000 SFF is about 70% faster on average than the A2000, but it also costs 2.5 times more. Well, as is often the case in a lot of these edge cases, bleeding edge tech is never going to scale linearly with performance. If you want more performance in the same package and at the same TDP, it's going to cost exponentially more. And that's what we see here today. So who is the RTX 4000 Ada generation SFF for? Well, it's definitely not for you and me, especially if you're looking at it from a gaming standpoint. While professional NVIDIA cards can play games, as I've shown many times on this channel before, that's not what they're designed to do. This is a $1,250 card. It's meant to go into workstations or be an AI accelerator in a server rack, not sit there and pump out frames. But just like I've shown on the channel a number of times, that doesn't mean that professional cards can't play games. At $1,250, it's not a cheap card. This is not something that you're going to buy just for the lulz. This is a card where you need to have an exact use case for it. For me, this is going to power my second generation of my Xbox One S case mod, or might even be a full custom case build. I haven't quite figured that one out, but make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss whatever this eventually goes into. Whoever this is for, whether it's data centers, workstations, CAD designers, or small form factor gamers who want the absolute most dense package they can possibly get, $1,250 is not cheap, but it's also, again, the de facto winner and really the best option there is if you are after a no compromise system. But what do you guys think of these small form factor professional cards? Are they only for CAD workstations and am I off my base? Or would you like to see some form factor of this more relegated towards gaming? Let me know down in the comments below. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on social media at Craft Computing, and if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, consider joining the Patreon. Link is down in the video description and literally helps keep the lights on around here. That's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. Beer for today should be a good one. This is from Freem. It is their Las Piñas. So their Pina Colada inspired beer. Carefree Island vibes are deliciously delivered with Las Piñas. Our refreshing ode to summer days, barrel aged with fresh chopped pineapple. This golden hued beauty is your liquid passport to the tropics. Remember, when opening a corked beer, always point it directly at your face. Literally smells like fresh pineapple. Like freshly cut, super tangy, a little bit sour, a little bit sweet, very vibrant, very juicy, surprisingly smooth. Wow. So this is a barrel-aged beer. That barrel is doing work, let me tell you. I was actually expecting a much more intense flavor because that nose is just so poignant, shockingly smooth, shockingly full-bodied. It's not a sour beer, but you'd be led to think that just by smelling it. It's tart, yet it has a nice full body to it. It's sour and very citrusy, but with a super smooth finish. I like this one a lot. Getting right here at the bottom of this beer, and I wanted to circle back because it's changed significantly from the beginning. Whereas before, the aroma was almost a little too pungent, a little too on the nose with freshly sliced fruit. It's mellowed out quite significantly. And as it's warmed up, a little bit more of that tartness is coming out. It's a little bit more like the beer I expected when it was cold, but as it's a little warmer. That barrel, like I think I said, is still doing work. This is a very well-balanced, full-bodied beer that happens to be pineapple-based. That's not something that I can say with almost any other pineapple-based beer. This is more like a cider that's been barrel-aged than a beer that I've had before. Really, really great, especially if you're into pineapple. Cheers, guys.